Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to welcome you to this really important conversation to have right now. Um, and also to begin with, I just want to say this is a crazy time, and I really appreciate everyone showing up. Of course, in the wake of Hurricane Helene, and now we're waiting for Hurricane Milton. I think that we're really beginning to see the impacts in real time for the lack of action that we've had in regards to the climate crisis. So I want to take a moment, first of all, just to pay our respects to those who have been lost and those who are currently suffering in the wake of Hurricane Helene. And I think that I just really hope that people can stay safe during this time. And one of the things that does happen during these times is oftentimes we do see people's better natures coming out in terms of neighbors helping neighbors. And so that's really what I want to focus on right now. I think that people during these difficult times, oftentimes people's strength comes out, and we get to see that people just look at each other as human beings who want to help other human beings. And so that's why we are all here today. And I really appreciate everyone being here. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We've got Rafe Pomerance, who is a Senior Arctic Policy Fellow with the Woodwell Climate Research Institute, and he's also been working with Rethink Energy Florida to help create an upper limit to sea level rise. Go ahead, Rafe, to say a few words.
Oh, well, greetings, everyone. I'm up north. I'm with you through the Weather Channel, uh, many hours a day, it seems, in this dramatic moment. I should say a few words about myself and my career. I've been in the climate field since the late 1970s when the room was pretty empty. And I've worked with a lot of scientists. I worked with the press. In the policy field, I was 6 years as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Back in the 90s, I was a climate negotiator for the United States. And basically, I've tried to create campaigns around specific elements of the climate issue over that time. And now I'm engaged working with Kim Ross and others in trying to create a new metric for the climate system known as an upper limit to sea level rise.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. I also want to introduce, we've got Herb Simmons, who is author of Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and he's also here representing the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Please say a few words, Herb. Oh, we can't hear you.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. It's hard to imagine a more important question and issue than sea level rise in the larger context of climate. And I'll simply say, as you said, I've attempted to begin to invent at least a portion of a new climate vocabulary in my book, which I'm not trying to hawk, but I'll at least show the title, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. I got started working on climate about a decade ago. One of the first things I did was with a partner, we got our home county, where I am now, Montgomery County, Maryland, next door to Washington, D.C., to declare the first climate emergency in the United States and the second in the world in 2017, and also set some of the toughest greenhouse gas standards. And I'm now a co-founder and board member of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition that I'll be speaking about in more detail later on. So thank you for organizing this area, and look forward to the panel discussion and the questions and answers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Herb. And we also have Larry Kalkstein. He is a former member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2, And he's also now president of Applied Climatologists working to cool cities. Thank you for being here, Larry, and please say a few words to the group.
Thank you, Aria. It is a pleasure. I'm a bioclimatologist. Most of our work relates to developing heat health warning systems for cities around the world. We've been funded by the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation and others. Right now, our biggest project is Governor Newsom passed AB 2238, the law to develop a California heat wave ranking system. That is, we actually rank heat waves like hurricanes for the state. I will describe that effort today. And then we also work on cooling solutions. We work with the 3M Corporation and other companies who make reflective roofing and other products. And we can actually estimate how much cooler, if these are used, how much cooler we can make the urban area and how many lives we could save. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to discussing these things.
Thank you so much. So glad you're here. And I'm going to go ahead and begin with Rafe today. So as you know, getting government to really take the right kinds of actions in order to reduce temperatures to safe levels has been incredibly challenging, especially in the state of Florida. We've got a lot of political resistance to the types of actions that we really need to take. So we've seen that global agreements have currently focused on keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming through emissions reductions. Unfortunately, temperatures have already begun to breach that 1.5 degree limit that has been set by international groups and negotiations. So right now, Florida has already seen a foot of sea level rise since the 1960s, and we're really beginning to see the consequences in real time in terms of the impacts on natural disasters and the way things have really exacerbated. Now, I love the concept of creating an upper limit to sea level rise because I think it helps people visualize the impact in a more tangible way. And I think that this tool, especially in the state of Florida, could be helpful in getting legislators to actually pay the kind of attention that they need to be paying to this issue. I'm wondering if you could speak with us a bit, Rafe, about the current sea level rise risks at the current rate of warming and how these risks might be made more tangible by focusing on the specific risks related to sea level rise.
Sure. Well, one of the important facts about sea level rise is that it is accelerating now and will continue to do so, or depending on the rate, of course, but it will continue to move up over time because of built-in temperature changes to both the ocean and the ice of the world, which is disappearing. The two biggest sources of sea level rise being melting glaciers and the disintegrating ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, and warming of the ocean, which creates thermal expansion. Our idea here, I think, Aria, which you put your finger on, is that we want to see a more tangible limit to the climate system. In other words, the world has organized itself since the Paris Accord on the temperature targets agreed there, 1.5 or 2, depending on how you read it, or both. And those are global averages. And it's our feeling that those are very difficult for most people to grasp as to what they mean. So my group with Kim Ross and other colleagues, particularly in Florida, but now sort of growing nationally and internationally, came up with this idea of creating an upper limit to sea level rise in order to drive policy by allowing people to grasp what's at stake in a much easier way. And as everybody or most everybody knows what sea level rise can do or has an idea of it, whereas global temperature, the average global temperature is a tougher concept to relate to. So our idea is to create a second metric in the climate system. First metric is the global temperature regime, but the second metric would be an upper limit to sea level rise. And because of, let me get this technical part on the table here. It's actually impossible in the short run to create an absolute lid, at least as far as we understand with current models, to create a lid or a top to sea level rise, because the sea level rise is going to continue to grow into the future, decades and so on. However, what is possible to do when you look at all the models is to lower the rate. And the difference in the rate of sea level rise in the future is up to us going forward, up to the world. And so depending on the emissions path, the rate of sea level rise will be very different going forward. And our point here is that we feel that, back to this point about how sea level rise is much easier to grasp than the global temperature. We started this with the idea in Florida, okay? Florida, here is Florida's faced has a kind of existential threat from sea level rise over time. And yet Florida is not in the leadership nationally, globally. The state doesn't really have that serious, it doesn't have a serious climate or greenhouse gas reduction plan. So our idea, I'll stop in a second, it was to ask of Florida policymakers like the governor, okay, what's your upper limit? How much is too much? Where are you willing to let the system go? That's kind of the first question. And we figured that if people had to actually confront the different futures before them, that would move them in terms of, once you get to that point, then you become much more interested in seeing a change in the emissions scenarios going forward. And Florida, in our mind, could have become a global leader in that regard.
I want to interject a question here.
Sure.
I want to interject a question
Sorry,
here.
went on a bit long there.
So no, not at all. So at the current rate, where we're at right now, once we get to 2050, what do we expect sea level rise to be if we don't do anything to change our current trajectory?
Well, I think 2050, we're on track for 2 feet. We've had a foot so far. So in 26 years, that's another foot. And something like that is highly, something close to that's highly likely to occur. However, where the breakout comes is kind of after that, where if you've lowered the emissions rate, you begin to see a divergence in the rate of sea level rise. And by 2100, it becomes enormous. The potential difference between 2.5 feet or 3 feet and 6 or 9 feet. Now, just to say one more word there, we've got sort of two technical points about what does it mean. One is to lower the rate of sea level rise to the minimum. That's A, okay? And B is to stop the disintegration of Greenland and Antarctica. Now, there is no more important, those are catastrophic events once they occur, because the amount of sea level rise that they will bring is mind-boggling, is unimaginable. So what we're trying to do is focus the world, no small thing here, on limiting the rate of sea level rise in order to shrink the projected impacts, and save us from a catastrophic event in the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica.
Could you please speak to what those impacts would be? Let's say if we do lose Greenland, for instance. I mean,
Well,
what are we actually looking
I was
at?
listening to a lecture the other day. Greenland, when the scientists have looked at the bottom of Greenland and the terrestrial environment, and they could tell that Greenland did not exist not that long ago. I don't know how many thousands of years ago. But we know that Greenland can disappear, and Greenland has 24 feet of sea level rise in it. Now, Okay, well, then people usually say, well, that's very far off. Well, I've been around this stuff long and know that nobody has, yes, it's a ways off for sure, but what could happen is we've warmed things enough where that's locked in. So we know that this massive amount of sea level rise is going to occur. At what rate? That's a big question. But um, this is a civilization kind of question, whether the civilization lets Greenland and Antarctica go. And you can look at maps of the future of Florida under those scenarios, and there's a lot of it or most of it that's probably disappeared, and
Right.
depending on which level you take.
Right. Now, do you have what are your thoughts? And I know these things are so difficult when it comes to
Yeah.
being able to project the future. Um, but at the current rate,
Yeah.
how much time does it seem like we have before we might lose the ability to come back from where we're at and protect
Uh,
us from
well, that's
melting?
yeah, good question. Well, we've already passed a certain point where we've locked in a certain amount of sea level rise at an
Mhm.
accelerating pace. The question is whether we decide to lower the future rate. Now,
Mhm.
how long does it take to change the rate based on changing the global concentration of greenhouse gases? And when you look at the
Yeah.
models, you see this divergent. On a low emissions path, there's a big change, let's say between 2050 and 2100, that, maybe that's 3 or 4 feet difference
Right.
by the end of the century, depending on the emission scenarios. That's huge. Now, where is the state of Florida on this? The state of Florida should absolutely be out front. And there is no,
Yes.
so the question, here, Florida is about to experience record-breaking storm surge in 2 days. So this is a moment to how does Florida, the state, come out of this massive disruption and destruction? Sometime in the future when people's lives have been put back together, what does the state have to say about its future? And it's kind of a moment to seize in that sense of um, what have we learned here and what does it say about the future path of Florida, the rest of the world, and how we live on the planet.
Exactly. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and turn to Herb Simmons now. And thank you, Herb, for being here. Now, you're here representing Healthy Planet Action Coalition. And I know that Healthy Planet Action Coalition has a different strategy and approach for dealing with the risks we're currently facing right now in terms of sea level rise. And I'd like you to go ahead and take a moment to explain what the climate triad approach is and why it is that you feel that's necessary right now in order to address the risks we're facing in terms of sea level rise.
Oh, thank you, Aria. And please don't hesitate to interject your questions as well to keep us on track. First of all, let me say that I agree with everything that Rafe said, and that aggressive emission reductions is absolutely essential. It makes a huge difference between X sea level rise and all the other climate, sort of disasters that I don't need to go into right now, reducing their intensity and their frequency and so forth. And so nothing I say should take away from that. But we believe at the Healthy Climate Action Coalition, which is an international organization of climate scientists and policy experts and everyday people, we believe that there are other tools that are essential that must be added to our climate toolbox in addition to, not instead of, emission reductions. And the other two tools are large-scale removal of the greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, carbon, but not necessarily just that. It can be nitrous oxide or methane as well. The science is still being developed there to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere that is essentially the cause of the climate. The climate problems are not caused by what we emit today, but the legacy of what we've emitted over 200 years because of the chemistry, it's still up there by and large, and it's like a blanket. It gets thicker and thicker. But that will take a long time. That's a massive effort that will be equal in size to all the infrastructure we have in creating the oil industry, for example, around the world. So it's something that, we need to do. It's essential, but will take decades. So the question becomes, what can we do now? Well, not literally now, but what can we do in the shorter term? And what we call direct climate cooling, which basically is a broad name for the whole suite of potential ways to, as we say, directly cool the climate through either large-scale ecosystem restoration, forests and so forth, or through technical engineering means like putting sulfur in the sky or salt in the sky or other materials, iron in the ocean, that has the potential. And there's enormous amount of now scientific research showing that potential is likely to be truly the case, that can cool the climate in a matter of years rather than decades, and give us the time for emission reductions and carbon removal to work. And that should, though there's a lot more research that needs to be done on the impacts of doing that on, for example, sea level rise, on hurricane frequency and intensity, on heat, on droughts and all that. But all of the science so far shows that it's likely to have a significant positive impact as a complement to emission reductions and removal. And so, but it's quite honestly, people are afraid of it. It's not talked about. It's sort of, oh, we're messing with Mother Nature and all the rest of that. Of course, that's what we're doing right now, which in creating the climate crisis. So we believe that the world community needs to broaden its perspective, needs to objectively, urgently, and equitably take a look at all these techniques that are out there, and maybe more yet to be invented, and come up with the right combination of emission reductions, as Rafe talked about, carbon removal, and directly cooling the climate that we've sort of labeled the climate triad, as you said. And we think that could have enormous benefits for Florida, for any place that is prone to sea level rise, to intensities of hurricanes that we're now experiencing, and just the kind of extreme weather that's occurring everywhere on the planet. So let me stop right there.
Herb, could you speak to the current parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Many years ago, Bill McKibben identified 350 parts per million as being a level that we should not cross, because if we crossed it, things would get unstable and be very hard to come back from. So where are we at right now when it comes to carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere?
Well, I think as most of our viewers probably know, we're well in excess, tragically, of that 350. 425 depends on what year, what month, but we're in that sort of 420, 425 range, and going up 2 or 3 parts per million per year of carbon dioxide. And we're also going up on methane and other greenhouse gases to get that number even higher. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing the evidence that clearly we're not at a safe level today. And again, just to repeat or rephrase it a little differently, emission reductions, however necessary they are, can only slow the increase in the increase in parts per million, the increase in the size and thickness of the blanket. It cannot begin to take the blanket off. Only carbon removal can take the blanket off. But in the meantime, we need to do, as we recommend, we need to urgently research the possibility of directly cooling the planet to give us time to start dismantling that greenhouse gas blanket that's creating the havoc that will only get worse year after year.
Now, I'd like to acknowledge that there is a certain amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that get removed naturally from the atmosphere through trees and oceans, and it gets absorbed and pulled down naturally, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
I mean, the Earth is a very complex and magical system that when it's in a rough equilibrium, which it has been more or less, at least in our era, what's called the Holocene era, until just literally the last couple hundred years of the Industrial Revolution, which basically, year by year is creating this imbalance so that what gets pulled down out of the atmosphere is less than gets put up because of all of our, there's literally over a billion, that's with a B, not an M, a billion vehicles on the roads around the world, 97% of which or whatever are burning carbon dioxide, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, in addition to that, a concern that I have and that has come up through various scientific studies that I've read is that because temperatures have warmed to the levels that they've warmed, that has also released additional natural feedbacks. So, for instance, the forest fires that we have that produce additional carbon dioxide emissions. And then we've got the melting permafrost, which is going to be releasing more methane gas. So I just kind of wanted to pull that into the discussion in terms of why it is that the current approach may not be enough anymore, because we have reached some some points where our natural systems aren't pulling down as many of those emissions as they used to pull down, and nature has actually become a source at this point in time. So could you speak to how direct climate cooling can help reduce those feedback loops as well?
Yes, first, you're absolutely right, and that's why whether you want to use the word urgent or emergency or some synonym is absolutely essential. As somebody said a while back, basically, if we win the climate battle slowly, we've lost. Time is the key variable in climate because of these feedbacks. And as a result, we're in a situation where, for example, there was a paper written a couple of years ago that said the scientists used to, as recently as 10 or 20 years ago, used to believe that what are called these tipping points, where elements such as Rafe talked about, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, the currents in the ocean, the permafrost, as you mentioned, Aria, wouldn't tip over to the point where we can no longer control them until we reached 5 degrees centigrade, which gives us some time, a few decades, maybe 100 years. Tragically, the current science says these tipping points are likely to activate at temperatures around where we are now, 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade. In other words, our margin of error has completely disappeared according to not just the latest science, but what we're all experiencing. And the idea is that putting this cooling, sort of sunscreen on the planet in the safest and most effective way, and we're not suggesting anything that's reckless that should be researched, can begin to reverse those temperatures, slow down those tipping points. Nobody knows whether they can be reversed or sea level rise can be literally stopped, but it can make a dramatic difference, we believe, if it's done urgently, effectively, and by the entire world community, so there's buy-in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that the point is that when it comes to the things that are currently at stake, we need to reduce risk. And there is a certain amount of scientific uncertainty right now, and people who are assessing the situation in different ways. But there's a lot of science that says, as you were saying, that we are already beginning to reach points where we might not be able to come back from various tipping points. So that really emphasizes the importance of being able to rethink our strategy to make sure that we are using a strategy that is minimizing risks in the instance of a certain amount of uncertainty. So thank you, Herb. And I want to go ahead and take a moment and turn to Larry right now. Thank you, Larry, for joining us. Now, go ahead and speak with, you have done so much work when it comes to understanding the impacts of heat, when it comes to the human impacts of heat, and what people are experiencing on the ground in real time. Please, give us a little bit more. You touched upon that a bit in your introduction, but give us a little bit more information about what you have found through the work you've been doing, specifically focus on those impacts on the human level.
Sure. Thank you, Aria. Good to be here. Heat is a bit of a different problem than sea level rise and some of the things that Herbert's talking about. People have been dying from the heat for decades. It is a problem that has been ongoing, and we're actually only gaining real knowledge by the population that heat is so important because it kills more people on Earth than any other weather-related disaster by far. The worst hurricane we've ever had, Hurricane Katrina, killed about 1,500 people and was a terrible tragedy. In the US, every year, in an average year, 1,500 to 2,000 people die of the heat. But they don't die by mowing their lawns or playing tennis outside and getting heat exhaustion. The increases in heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory failures jump up very, very rapidly during these periods of time. Some years we have 5,000 people dying of heat, which is incredible. So we need to do something about this, and that's what our role is all about. We develop these heat warning systems. We deal with how cooling mechanisms can help urban areas in particular, not the global situation like Herbert's talking about, but again, these reflective roofs, films, adding more vegetation will help lessen the urban heat island because most of these deaths are there. These are the kinds of things we're working on. And we're even working on trying to understand which air masses, we're air mass climatologists, certain air masses are the ones that kill more people. And so, for example, when we hear that the Earth is warmed by 1.5 degrees, that means nothing unless we know air masses are doing the warming. For example, if it's the cool polar air masses that are warming by 1.5 degrees in the summer, that's not a big deal. But if it's the hottest, most humid air masses that's important. And our present work also focuses on showing that it is the very hot and dry and very hot and humid air masses that are making up most of the warming that is occurring, especially overnight. That's the worst of it. The other thing I want to mention, and I'll be glad to stop and let you ask questions, is that it is not the intensity of the heat alone that kills people. It's weather variability. And what I mean by this is that the places where heat is a real problem are in mid-latitudes, where you have, let's take New York or Washington, most of the days are in their 80s, and then all of a sudden you have a 100-degree week. That's what kills the people. Where I live in South Florida, it's hot every day. Every day is 90, 91, 89. Believe it or not, we have less heat-related deaths here than we do in Washington, D.C., Toronto, Chicago, and so on. Even sometimes some of those cities have more heat-related deaths than Phoenix for the same reason, because people are used to the heat. The urban structures are designed for the heat. So in fact, this weather variability is important, and the timing of the heat wave is important. Usually it's heat waves early in the season that kill more people or send them to the hospital rather than late. Because first of all, we get acclimatized to the heat. And secondly, many of the vulnerable people who've died, who are going to die of the heat, die in the early heat waves, and there are less vulnerable people left to die later on. So when we develop our systems, we aren't as concerned about human comfort. We're just concerned about human health outcomes. And that's what we're working on right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So you are implementing various strategies on a local level that help keep those cities and those areas cool, right?
Not only
So
that,
now, go ahead.
No, no, not only that, we're designed to help the stakeholders who have to intervene when these heat waves are called. That's why ranking is so important. A level 3 heat wave, which generally represents the top 10% of mortality induced heat waves, you have to do a lot more. That's like a category 5 hurricane. You have to do a lot more than a level 1 heat wave. But historically, heat waves have never been categorized. So our goal is to help stakeholders understand the level of intervention that they have to go into to save lives in different cities. I mean, do you open all the shelters? Do you go all out? Does the city spend millions of dollars to do something? Or do they just announce to the people, hey, be careful? And so we think this is really important, much like what I may have to do if I have to evacuate from Marco Island if Milton gets too close, as opposed to a small category 1 hurricane that goes by where we just tie down our furniture. So that's the idea.
Thank you. So one of the things that I think is interesting is, for one thing, before you and I spoke, I had no idea the actual impacts of heat on how many people were dying just from the heat. But beyond the human impacts, we also have impacts in our oceans. We have animals that are dying because of heat. We have
Absolutely.
ecosystems that are dying because of heat. So, that's good for us to know in terms of understanding how important it is that we not only deal with emissions reductions, but we deal with actually reducing heat. And what you're doing is dealing with various direct climate cooling techniques on a local level and reducing heat impacts on a local level for humans. But, big picture thinking, we want to think about our entire biosphere and how we can reduce risks for ecosystems and for, various lives around the world. But I find your strategy to be so fascinating, because the things that if you could speak a little bit to the techniques that you were implementing on a local level, how it is that they work, and the kinds of impacts you're seeing in terms of how the temperature is being reduced in those areas where you're doing that work.
Sure. Well, we can go on 2 levels. First of all, the technology behind the heat ranking systems, they are on a computer. They're updated whenever a weather service office puts out a new forecast. We do them for Greece. We do them for Spain. We are starting in India. And as I said, we're going to do it for the entire state of California, which we're also working on. And so this way, maybe not even the public is so important. People who run hospitals, utility companies, police, fire, they need to know the conditions for the next 3 or 4 days are going to be terrible, much like you do with the warning of hurricanes. So our goal is also to get it on the phone. I have to see my phone. There it is, on the phone, so that people can just type in their zip code and they could see what is going on and how dangerous things are with this ranking system. Now, the other level is the cooling part of it. And this is where 3M, which is really quite a green company, they started making dynamite, but they're really a green company right now. They have developed such technologies. They can quadruple the albedo or reflectance of roofs. So just imagine if half the homes and also half the businesses, when you fly into an airport and you see those flat white roofs in the industrial buildings, they're working with those too. If you could quadruple the albedo or reflectance of those roofs, a lot of those roofs take up 20, 30% of the whole urban landscape. Imagine what you could do to the climate. And we have found out that evaluating certain heat waves, we can reduce temperatures in the bad air masses, the ones I was talking about, by 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. That may not sound like a lot, but it's below the threshold for many deaths. So instead of having a heat wave kill 120 people, we make it, maybe it will only kill 75 or 80. We can save 30 or 40 lives. We've done studies to show that over a decade period, we might be able to save 500 lives in a city only because you've used these particular features. Or if you have films on your windows and your air conditioner is working less hard, air conditioning adds to the urban heat island. Did you ever see those when you see a detective movie and their helicopters are going over New York City and those giant compressors on the roofs of those buildings are producing amazing amounts of heat? Imagine if you could cut that by 1/3. A city like New York in Manhattan is 1/3 air conditioned space. if you could reduce the amount of air conditioned use because of these heat reducing features, imagine what you could do to at least the local climate. I'm not saying this is going to solve climate change, but it certainly will help the local climate and save lives.
So now when you talk about reducing, you said 1 degree to 2 degrees.
Yep.
Is that Fahrenheit or Celsius?
It's Celsius. So it's about 3 to 4 degrees. It's really sizable. And we do this just for the heat waves because, like I said, it is important if cool days are 1 or 2 degrees warmer, but people's health are not going to be affected. We want to go to the hot, humid air masses and the hot and dry air masses when New York City gets to 99 or 100 degrees. If it only gets to 96, still very hot, but many people who would die if it got to 100 will not die if it only gets to 96. We're not going to end heat waves. We're just saying that we could lower them to below a threshold where a lot of people die.
Now, I want to, for the audience, just to make sure we're really clear about the entire concept of libido as well. So the idea that darker surfaces, I mean, we all know if you go out and you're wearing all black and it's a hot day, you're going to be really attracting a lot of heat. And when you've got a lighter color, you've got that bounce where there's more of the heat is reflecting off of you. So that's the entire idea behind direct climate cooling and the various strategies that are being implemented to cool things on a local level. So then that, expand that out to these other concepts of, we've got, when you've got ice melt, then, the ice is all this nice white area that has been reflecting heat in the poles, right? But as that ice melts, you've got more areas that are darker so that it's actually pulling in more heat. That's why the poles are now warming at an exponential rate compared to the rest of the planet. So, just kind of pulling it all together as to why it is that it's essential that we start talking about direct climate cooling, whether we start with the absolute zero risk ways that we can cool cities and save lives there, and also continue to think about other things that we can do to reduce risks in other areas and to generally cool the planet, that we've got a lot of different strategies that we could potentially be pulling in when it comes to how we pull ourselves out of this mess and start saving lives, saving ecosystems around the planet.
Well, one of the nice things is that many of these techniques are not expensive. A cool roof can be paid for by giving someone a tax break if they decide to put a cool roof on their house. So if the roof costs $30,000 and maybe they can get $8,000 or $10,000 back on their taxes, they may be willing to do it. These are not the kinds of things where individuals are always worried. The skeptics in particular, we're going to alter the whole United States economy by doing this in a negative way. No, there are cheaper ways of achieving these goals. And I think that these cool roof solutions, even if they're mainly concentrated in urban areas, are one of the ways to do it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, let's go ahead and open it up to conversations from the audience. I know we've got a lot of people here, and everybody turn on your cameras and let's go ahead and pull this into a larger discussion. Any questions out there? Let me see here. So first of all, I want to say, I know we've got a question about, is the United Nations embracing this? This was a question that was asked earlier, and I believe that has to do with embracing the upper limit to sea level rise. Rafe, would you want to take that question?
I mean, I think my video is okay and my audio is okay, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So the UN is a really interesting question at this point. Our group was very active a couple of weeks ago, was it? When the United Nations General Assembly, every year they convene in September. It's a meeting at the level of heads of state that come from all over the world. And this year they decided to devote one entire day to sea level rise. That's pretty amazing. Then, they have a lot of member states of the UN that are highly vulnerable, like small island developing states. Anyway, they had a full day, and we made a great effort to bring our idea forward in that context. And so we had the first round of discussions we've ever had with permanent ambassadors to the UN and some people from the national governments in order to try to raise the visibility of the issue. We didn't succeed. We didn't really expect to, but we managed to enter into a range of conversations at that particular UN. Now, second thing to say about this is that the Secretary General of the UN has been very outspoken on sea level rise. In fact, a couple of weeks before the UN General Assembly gave a speech to a convening of all the island states out in the Pacific at Tonga, in the nation of Tonga. And it's worth his speech was really powerful. And at the same time, the UN issued a really excellent technical update on the future of sea level rise, which is available. So the UN itself is a forum, an important one, and a place to begin to raise the issue. Ultimately, we've had some discussions about how do you take this into the Conference of the Parties of the climate negotiations, and we're continuing to investigate that. So now, just one more plug here. One of the things that has struck us is that a governor from the United States who decided to take this on could create a global profile by taking this idea into the largest multilateral forums, like the governor, governor who might be willing, who has a lot at stake. Guess what state that might be, but an unlikely governor to do that. But some other places, anyway, it's just a tactical idea that governors are particularly in a leadership position on this. So the UN is important. It's active. The Secretary General is very outspoken. They've got all this technical information. So there you are. It's not lost on them because there's so many. One of the things about the upper limit is that it affects sea level rise, affects so many governments, so many land masses or islands around the world. So many huge populations have a stake in this.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, the impacts of climate are frequently felt by those who can really deal with those impacts the least, the global south, coastal areas, people who have less funds to deal with in terms of helping them to be more resilient. So this would be an issue. I would hope that we could bring this framing to people who are a part of small island states, the global south.
Well, yeah.
And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, kind of what we're trying to do here is run this effort on two different levels. One is sort of the global level.
Yeah.
And the other is at the local state level. You can do it at both levels. You can campaign for this, trying to get endorsements and leadership in different levels of government and elsewhere.
Yeah. And which obviously helps reinforce how important it is to vote for people who are going to understand the risks of the climate crisis and actually be available, ready, and willing
Right.
to
Since
take
you
action.
brought up the question of the vote, it's actually a dramatic moment because you have the 2024 election is between candidates who take climate seriously and denialists at the presidential level and at the Senate level. Recall that your then governor, who's a senator now, Scott, remember he never let the words climate change be mentioned during his time as governor. Anyway, it's an amazing right in the shadow of this hurricane. Anyway, that's a sort of a moment to ponder.
We have been dealing with those issues yet again when it comes to not being able to discuss climate crisis, ironically enough, when it comes to dealing with the impacts. So we also did have another question leading up to this, which has to do with how people can help us scale the message. And I think there are some really wonderful resources from on the Rethink Energy Florida website, correct? That help really give some talking point tools. And could you speak to that,
Yeah,
Rafe,
so
or could
I
we get
think
someone put some links
Kim
in?
Ross, who runs the Rethink Energy Florida, I think she's taking in this seminar. She has managed to put together all kinds of materials on their website that we have developed, including an article we did for Foreign Affairs that was published, a very good piece that was in National Geo about this idea, and a whole range of fact sheets that we've developed around impacts in Florida, and plus some of the materials that we developed for the UN General Assembly. So there's a rich list of materials there on the Rethink Energy website.
Yeah. Another question that I have, I know I put this together because I think it's so important to see the kinds of work that Larry's doing on a local level that go above and beyond focusing only on emissions reductions that can still have that impact. But one of the things that I have been really trying to figure out is how is it that those local impacts, how do they affect the globe when it comes to cooling cities, and how that might affect the way that our temperature masses mix up globally. Could you speak to that at all, Larry?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I think we're probably all talking on different scales here. Herbert and Rafe obviously are talking on a global scale, and I am talking on a more local scale. I will tell you this. I find it less effective to tell my audiences that if climate change occurs as it's happening now, double the number of people are going to die of heat in 2100 or whatever the number happens to be. One of the problems is that there are many, many skeptics out there, whether you like it or not. This election is split. Half this population is supporting candidates that are not there to make climate change be a priority, unfortunately. From my vantage point on the local scale, it's very important to me to appeal to those candidates. They're not just a bunch of idiots. They have reasons for believing in the way they do. And what I do is try to tell them that from my vantage point, heat is already the leading weather-related killer right now. You want to talk about climate change? It probably will get worse. Why aren't we doing anything about this right now? All of these local attempts have to be done right now. They will benefit climate change. There's no doubt about it. But as soon as you start your speech by saying, or at least on my level, I'm sure on Rafe's and Herbert's, it's something else. At my level, as soon as I start my speech by saying we are going to have the double number of heat-related deaths in 2100, I have lost half my audience. And that is part of the problem that we have today. So I think it's important to tell them that not only will climate change benefit from these local, if they're widespread, local interventions, you are also going to help us right now because we have found heat killing people by the thousands for many, many decades right now. And we have ignored it because there's poor public awareness. Buildings are not designed usually to deal with heat. Our parks, our urban structures all have to be changed. They will all benefit climate change. But I think we should emphasize the here and now for many of those people. I know that's a controversial opinion, and I'm working on local scale, but that's the way I feel about it right now, and I have found that to be effective. It may not be effective when you're talking about sea level rise and some of these other issues, but it is more effective from my level.
I think it's so important that we're in such an urgent situation. So we need to have something that's making an impact wherever we can right now,
Exactly.
is really the bottom line. And it's difficult because there's a lot of political issues on both sides when it comes to whether we should act in response to the climate crisis this way or whether we should act that way. And in fact, amongst activists right now, there's been a lot of talk against drawing down emissions, it seems. And so that's one of the concerns I have is you've got, even amongst the activist communities, a lot of these these solutions can be very, very controversial. And I want to say on a personal level, I do understand there are concerns because we have to reduce emissions. We can't just stick a Band-Aid on the situation and continue with business as usual, because business as usual is what got us into the mess to begin with. So just with a little, that as a background and acknowledge, we've got a question from Kim Ross here. It says, as you stated, reducing carbon dioxide emissions alone will no longer help us. Atmospheric carbon dioxide removal is essential in order to cool down the planet. Several technologies are being tested. Why the United Nations and most nations are not talking much about it. Don't you think we need an atmospheric carbon dioxide removal global Marshall Plan is the question. How about increasing methane emissions from permafrost? Okay, so the methane emissions from permafrost is clearly to remind us all about when we've got the poles warming at the rate they're warming, and we've got that permafrost is melting, that is releasing methane from the permafrost. It's also being released from warming oceans, so creating more emissions, which is why we need to cool. As part of emissions reductions is cooling. At this point, if we can cool in the right areas, we're actually reducing emissions in addition to dealing with the amplified risks just from warming. So I just wanted to, share that question and see if anybody else has anything else that they want to add or in response to that framing. Thank you, Herb.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think part of the dilemma, and we start by unfortunately having to recognize that climate change is perhaps the most challenging collective action problem humanity has ever faced, because the actions that we take individually don't have an impact on the world climate for many years, as opposed to, well, what Larry is doing has an impact right away, which is why it's so important. But part of the challenge is when we went from Kyoto Accord to Paris, we basically went to a bottoms-up approach, because where every country sort of works on its own. But as these tipping points get activated and so forth, we no longer can have a system like that that's ineffective. And that's the challenge. How do we transition from a system where 200 countries do their own thing, we hope it all works out together, to one where we work collectively through international governance arrangements and so forth? And the last thing I want to say on that, because I know you're running out of time, is in my conversations with some climate leaders and scientists, they have indicated to me that there are a whole lot more leaders out there, and whether in science or in politics, who recognize the need for a more aggressive, broader approach, like the climate triad. They don't want to stick their necks out. So I think part of our challenge is getting a group of people to stick their necks out at the same time, because there's always safety in numbers. We see that in other fields.
Yeah.
It's who's going to go first because of the blowback, because of all the denialists and whatever. And I think I think the dam will break once people start coming out and saying we have to do more and do something differently. And that's why it's essential we keep our pedal to the metal, if you will, to make that happen.
Yeah. So I want to go ahead and we do need to wrap things up. Thank you all for being a part of this. And I just want to say, I think that the bottom line has to be, how do we reduce risk? We're dealing with a situation where we have basically been geoengineering the planet for quite some time in a very unintentional and rather reckless manner, in my view. And so we've got to fix the situation, because we're dealing with the impacts of that recklessness right now. But we don't want to see there being additional recklessness when it comes to any of these solutions. And I do understand that people are concerned about that, because they have seen a certain amount of recklessness in the past when it comes to our assumptions about what those global or local impacts will be to various ecosystems. So, but it's important that we assess risk and with a full, complete comprehension of what are the risks if we continue with the strategy now. What are the risks if we adopt a new strategy? And we just have to keep our mission when it comes to saving lives and reducing risk for the entire planet as we move forward. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, and thank you everyone who joined us in this conversation. And please feel free to add any important links that you think people need to know about in order to learn more about your work. And I just want to thank everyone for being here, especially during this time. And I just want everyone to stay as safe as possible in the coming week. Thank you.